The year was 218. Rome, a city built on the bones of gods and giants, was about to receive its new master, not a seasoned general or a shrewd politician, but a boy of 14, a Syrian priest of a strange, conical black stone. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but history would remember him by the name of his god, Elagabalus. He arrived not with the stoic dignity of an Augustus or a Trajan, but in a whirlwind of silk, cosmetics, and exotic music, a walking, breathing scandal that promised to unravel the very fabric of Roman identity. This was not merely a change of ruler, it was an invasion of tradition, a fever dream of religious ecstasy and sexual rebellion, poised to consume the heart of the world's greatest empire. And now, please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. Power in the late Roman Empire was a poisoned chalice, a prize won and held not by law or lineage alone, but by the cold, hard steel of the legions. The age of the 5 good emperors was a distant, sun-drenched memory, replaced by the chaotic barracks emperors and the brutal machinations of the Praetorian Guard. To understand the ascent of a boy priest to the throne, we must first journey into the bloody aftermath of the Severan dynasty. Septimius Severus, an African general, had seized power in the year 193, establishing a military monarchy that rested on the loyalty of the army, a loyalty he famously advised his sons to purchase at any cost. His son, Caracalla, took this advice to heart, ruling as a brutal despot whose reign was marked by the universal extension of Roman citizenship, move less about enlightenment and more about expanding the tax base, and his own assassination in 217. The architect of his death was his Praetorian prefect, Macrinus, a man of equestrian rank, a bureaucrat who dared to dream of purple robes. Macrinus made a fatal error. He tried to be a sensible, cost-cutting emperor in an age that demanded spectacle and military largesse. He alienated the army, the very institution that had made him, by attempting to roll back Caracalla's generous pay raises for new recruits. It was a blunder that would cost him his life and his legacy. While Macrinus fumbled with the reins of power in Rome, a storm was gathering in the east, in the opulent, sun-scorched city of Emesa. Here lived the remaining tendrils of the Severan dynasty, a family of powerful, ambitious Syrian women. At its head was Julia Maesa, the formidable sister of the late Empress Julia Domna, Septimius Severus's wife. Maesa was a master of political theater and intrigue, a woman who understood that in Rome, perception was reality, and a good story, even a fabricated one, was more potent than any law. She had 2 daughters, Julia Soaemias and Julia Mamaea, and each had a son. Soaemias's son was Varius Avitus Bassianus, the hereditary high priest of the sun god Elagabalus. Mamaea's son was Alexianus, later to be known as Severus Alexander. Julia Maesa saw in her grandson the beautiful, charismatic boy priest Bassianus, the perfect tool to reclaim her family's power. She began to weave a masterful deception, a lie that would resonate with the disgruntled soldiers of the nearby legions. She spread the rumor that Bassianus was not the son of his putative father, but was, in fact, the illegitimate son of the beloved and murdered Caracalla. She produced the boy, dressed in fine silks, his eyes lined with kohl, and presented him to the soldiers of the 3rd Gallic Legion. She reminded them of the Severan name, of the gold Caracalla had lavished upon them, and she opened her own vast coffers, promising a fortune to any who would champion her grandson's cause. The soldiers, already contemptuous of the parsimonious Macrinus, needed little persuasion. They saw the boy, they heard the name of Caracalla, and they saw the glint of gold. On the 16th of May, 218, they declared the 14-year-old priest of Elagabalus the true emperor of Rome. Macrinus, hearing of the rebellion, dispatched a force to crush it, but the legionaries, faced with the supposed son of Caracalla and the promise of wealth, defected. The tide had turned. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Antioch on the 8th of June. Macrinus's Praetorian Guard fought with disciplined ferocity, but the emperor himself, a man more suited to paperwork than the battlefield, lost his nerve and fled. His cowardice sealed his fate. He was captured and executed, his head sent back to the new emperor as a grisly trophy. The path to Rome was now open. The Senate, that ancient and now largely toothless institution, had no choice but to ratify the army's decision. They officially deified Caracalla and recognized the boy, now styled Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, as the legitimate ruler. The name was a carefully chosen piece of propaganda, linking him to both the revered Antonine dynasty and his supposed father. But the boy had another name he preferred, the name of his god, Elagabalus. And it was this god, not the gods of Rome, that he intended to serve. The city awaited its new emperor with a mixture of hope and trepidation, unaware that they were about to witness a reign so bizarre, so sacrilegious, so utterly alien to their traditions that it would be seared into the annals of history as a cautionary tale of absolute power wielded by a mind unmoored from reality. The Orgy king was coming. The journey from Syria to Rome was not merely a geographical transition. It was a procession of the bizarre, a rolling spectacle that served as a prelude to the cultural earthquake about to strike the capital. Elagabalus did not travel as a Roman emperor, but as a priest-king of the East. He was accompanied by a retinue of Syrian courtiers, eunuchs, and musicians, a vibrant, noisy caravan that scandalized the more conservative elements of the provinces through which it passed. The centerpiece of this procession was not the emperor himself, but his god. The black stone of Emesa, the Betail of Elagabalus, was housed in a magnificent chariot drawn by 6 white horses, which the emperor himself often led backward, his eyes fixed in adoration upon the conical idol. This image alone was a profound shock to the Roman psyche. An emperor, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, humbling himself before a foreign rock, was an inversion of the established order. The gods of Rome were patrons of the state, their rituals and traditions interwoven with the city's identity and success. Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, Juno, and Minerva were symbols of Roman gravity and power. Elagabalus's public devotion to his personal deity above all others was not just a matter of personal faith, it was a political statement, a declaration that the old ways were to be swept aside. His appearance was equally jarring. He rejected the traditional toga and military attire of his predecessors in favor of flowing, brightly colored silk robes, heavy makeup, and elaborate jewelry. He was often seen with his eyes painted, his cheeks rouged, a practice Romans associated with the most decadent and effeminate customs of the East, and with prostitutes. This was a deliberate performance, a visual rejection of Roman ideals of masculine austerity and martial vigor. He was presenting himself not as a princeps, a first citizen, but as a living deity, a monarch in the Hellenistic tradition, a concept anathema to the lingering republican sensibilities of the Roman elite. The administrative duties of the empire, meanwhile, were left to his grandmother, Julia Maesa, and his mother, Julia Soaemias. Maesa, the true architect of his rise, understood the necessity of maintaining a veneer of Roman tradition, even as her grandson dismantled it. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes, managing the bureaucracy, placating senators, and trying to mitigate the damage caused by Elagabalus's increasingly erratic behavior. Soaemias, on the other hand, seemed to revel in her son's excesses, encouraging his religious fanaticism and taking an unprecedented, and for many, scandalous role in public life. She was given the title Augusta, and even attended sessions of the Senate, a shocking breach of protocol in a world where the political sphere was exclusively male. The sources, particularly the notoriously unreliable Historia Augusta, paint a picture of a government run by a cabal of women and effeminate Syrians, a narrative designed to emasculate the emperor and horrify a patriarchal Roman audience. The emperor's appointments to high office further fueled the outrage. He bypassed the traditional cursus honorum, the established career path for Roman aristocrats, and instead elevated his own favorites, many of whom were chosen not for their competence or experience, but for their physical attributes or their willingness to participate in his debaucheries. Charioteers, dancers, barbers, and cooks were allegedly given powerful and lucrative positions, including the command of legions and the governorships of provinces. His chamberlain and likely lover, a handsome Carian slave named Hierocles, was granted immense influence, with the emperor reportedly delighting in being called Hierocles' queen and wife. Another favorite was the charioteer Gordius, who was made prefect of the Vigiles, the city's police and fire brigade. These appointments were a direct assault on the privileges and prestige of the senatorial and equestrian orders, the traditional ruling classes of the empire. It was one thing for an emperor to have low-born favorites, but it was another entirely to give them legitimate power over their social superiors. This was not just corruption, it was a social revolution, an upending of the natural order that struck at the very heart of the Roman class system. The city of Rome, which had waited for nearly a year for its new ruler, was about to receive not a savior, but a cultural cataclysm. The reports that preceded him spoke of strange rituals, of a god in the form of a black stone, of an emperor who dressed as a woman and promoted his lovers to the highest offices of the state. For the common people, it might have been a source of curious gossip. For the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, the twin pillars of power in the capital, it was a source of growing dread. They had accepted a Severan restoration, but they were about to get a Syrian religious revolution instead. Upon his arrival in Rome in the year 219, Elagabalus wasted no time in enacting his primary ambition, the complete transformation of Roman religion. His goal was not merely to introduce his god into the Roman pantheon, a common practice for emperors hailing from the provinces. He intended to supplant Jupiter himself to make the sun god of Emesa, Sol Invictus Elagabalus, the supreme deity of the Roman Empire. This was a religious revolution of unprecedented scale and audacity. His first major act was the construction of a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, the most sacred and politically significant of Rome's 7 hills, the traditional home of emperors and the site of the city's founding. This temple, the Elagabalium, was built to house the black stone, which was now set in a lavish golden shrine. To consecrate this new center of worship, Elagabalus committed an act of profound sacrilege. He ordered the most sacred relics of Roman religion to be transferred to the Elagabalium, effectively making them subordinate to his god. This included the eternal flame of Vesta, the Palladium, a statue of Pallas Athena believed to have been rescued from Troy, and the sacred shields of Mars. In his view, he was not destroying these traditions but subsuming them, creating a religious syncretism where all divine power flowed from his single, supreme deity. To the Romans, however, this was a desecration, a violation of the Pax Deorum, the peace between gods and mortals that ensured the city's prosperity and safety. The rituals themselves were as alien as the god they honored. Elagabalus, in his role as high priest, would perform daily ceremonies that were a feast of sensory overload. To the sound of cymbals, drums, and pipes, he would dance in ecstatic circles around the altar, clad in his finest silks, his face painted. Lavish sacrifices were made, not just of the usual animals, but of hecatomb sacrifices of 100 oxen at a time, with the blood flowing in rivers through the temple. The air would be thick with the smoke of incense and the smell of burning flesh. While these spectacles may have entertained some of the urban plebs, they horrified the aristocracy. Roman religious ceremonies were traditionally solemn, dignified, and precise affairs, governed by centuries of established procedure. Elagabalus's frenzied, emotional, and deeply personal style of worship was seen as barbaric and undignified, more akin to a foreign mystery cult than the state religion of a world empire. The most scandalous aspect of his religious project was the divine marriage he orchestrated. To provide his god with a consort, Elagabalus first chose Minerva, one of Rome's most beloved and important goddesses. He had her statue brought to the Elagabalium to be ritually wedded to the black stone. When he decided Minerva was too warlike, he annulled the marriage and instead chose the Carthaginian goddess Tanit, known as Calestis to the Romans, a celestial mother figure whose cult was popular in North Africa. This union was celebrated with enormous festivities and, more importantly, required the people of Rome to provide a dowry for the new divine bride, a thinly veiled tax that further lined the emperor's coffers. But the ultimate act of sacrilege was his own marriage. As the high priest of Elagabal, the emperor saw himself as the god's living incarnation. Therefore, his own marriage was a reflection of the divine union. He broke one of Rome's most sacred taboos by marrying Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. The Vestals were sworn to 30 years of celibacy, and breaking this vow was a capital offense, traditionally punished by being buried alive. For Elagabalus to not only take a Vestal as his wife, but to publicly declare that he did so in the hope of producing godlike children was an act of supreme arrogance and impiety that sent shockwaves through the city. He divorced her and married several other women, including the aristocratic Annia Faustina, a descendant of Marcus Aurelius, in a brief attempt to placate the Senate, before returning to Aquilia Severa. These marital scandals, combined with his religious revolution, created a potent cocktail of resentment. He was not just a bad emperor, he was a heretic, a blasphemer who was actively angering the gods and jeopardizing the very existence of Rome. The whispers against him in the Senate House and the Praetorian barracks grew louder, fueled by a potent mix of religious outrage, political frustration, and profound cultural disgust. The emperor's personal life was as much a source of scandal and outrage as his religious reforms, a relentless assault on every Roman norm of sexuality, gender, and decorum. The historical accounts, written by his enemies, are a litany of debauchery, a catalogue of perversions likely exaggerated for propaganda purposes but rooted in a core of undeniable truth. Elagabalus rejected the rigid gender roles of his society with a flamboyant and unapologetic zeal. He was, by all accounts, a figure of profound gender fluidity in a world that had no framework to understand it beyond moral condemnation. The sources, particularly Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, describe him as delighting in being called not emperor or lord, but queen, mistress, and the wife of his lover, the Carian charioteer Heracles. He reportedly offered vast sums of money to any physician who could surgically transform him into a woman, a detail that, whether true or not, speaks to the depth of his identification with a female persona. His palace on the Palatine Hill was transformed from a center of imperial administration into a stage for his personal theater of identity. He would depilate his body, wear wigs, and adorn himself in the manner of a female prostitute, allegedly even setting up a brothel within the palace, where he would personally solicit customers. He would mimic the voices and mannerisms of women, and his relationships with men were framed not in the traditional Roman model of dominant, penetrative masculinity, but in a submissive, receptive role that the Romans found deeply contemptible and emasculating. While same-sex relationships were not uncommon in ancient Rome, they were governed by strict protocols of status and power. A high-status male could engage in sexual acts with a lower-status male, such as a slave or a prostitute, as long as he maintained the dominant, active role. For an emperor, the most powerful man in the world, to willfully take on the passive, female role was a complete inversion of this code, a surrender of masculine authority that was seen as synonymous with a surrender of political authority. His relationship with Heracles was the most public and scandalous of these affairs. Elagabalus was said to be utterly besotted with the handsome Carian, flying into jealous rages and submitting to physical abuse from him, delighting in being beaten as a sign of his lover's affection. He wished to have Heracles officially declared Caesar and his heir, a move that his grandmother, Julia Maesa, swiftly blocked, recognizing it as a political impossibility that would trigger an immediate revolt. Another prominent figure in his inner circle was Aurelius Zoticus, an athlete from Smyrna whose prodigious physical endowments caught the emperor's eye. Zoticus was brought to Rome, given the title of cubicularius, chamberlain, and quickly married to the emperor in a lavish public ceremony. However, their marriage was short-lived, as Zoticus fell from favor, allegedly after failing to satisfy the emperor, and was swiftly exiled. These relationships were not conducted in private. Elagabalus seemed to take a perverse pleasure in shocking the public, in flouting the very conventions that defined a Roman man. His banquets were legendary, not for their political significance, but for their bizarre and often cruel theatricality. Guests might be seated on inflatable cushions that would deflate, dropping them into water, or they might be served meals made entirely of glass or stone replicas of food. In one infamous tale, he was said to have released a shower of so many rose petals from the ceiling during a feast that several guests were smothered to death, a story that, while likely apocryphal, perfectly captures the blend of aesthetic indulgence and casual cruelty that defined his reputation. He surrounded himself with a court of like-minded individuals, a so-called Senate of Women, presided over by his mother, which allegedly decreed rules on fashion, etiquette, and which carriages could be used by which class of woman. While this may have been little more than a formalization of the traditional influence of imperial women, his enemies portrayed it as another sign of the world turned upside down, a realm where women and effeminate men held sway, while true Roman virtues were mocked and discarded. The cumulative effect of this behavior was politically catastrophic. The Senate, already alienated by his religious policies and political appointments, saw his personal life as the ultimate confirmation of his unfitness to rule. The Praetorian Guard, the hyper-masculine military elite who served as the emperor's bodyguards, were particularly disgusted. They were sworn to protect the embodiment of Roman power, and they found themselves guarding a ruler who, in their eyes, was a parody of everything a Roman man should be. The loyalty they had shown to the son of Caracalla was rapidly curdling into contempt. As the scandals mounted and the emperor's behavior grew more erratic, the true power behind the throne, Julia Maesa, recognized that the political situation was becoming untenable. She had engineered her grandson's rise to power to restore her family's dynasty, but his actions were now threatening to destroy it entirely. Her creation was a monster she could no longer control. With the cold pragmatism that defined her, Maesa began to pivot, shifting her support from the flamboyant Elagabalus to her other grandson, the quiet, sober, and far more traditionally Roman Alexianus. This was a calculated and dangerous move, a political coup orchestrated from within the imperial family itself. Maesa's first step was to persuade Elagabalus to formally adopt his cousin as his son and heir. She argued that the emperor, as high priest, needed to devote himself entirely to his religious duties and should leave the mundane, earthly matters of state to a Caesar. Elagabalus, perhaps seeing a way to offload the tedious aspects of rule he so despised, or perhaps simply too naive to see the trap being laid, agreed. In the year 221, the 13-year-old Alexianus was given the title of Caesar and renamed Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander. The contrast between the two cousins could not have been more stark, and Maesa made sure everyone noticed. Alexander was presented to the Senate and the people as the epitome of Roman virtue. He was tutored by respected senators and scholars, dressed in a simple toga, and displayed a modest, serious demeanor. He was, in essence, everything Elagabalus was not. He became the focal point for the hopes of the traditional Roman elite, a living rebuke to the incumbent emperor. The Praetorian Guard, in particular, quickly developed a deep affection and loyalty for the young Caesar. They saw in him a return to normalcy, a future emperor who would respect their martial values and restore dignity to the throne. Elagabalus, however, was not entirely oblivious. He soon realized that his cousin's growing popularity was a direct threat to his own position. He saw the way the soldiers and senators looked at Alexander with respect, a look they no longer gave him. A paranoid jealousy began to consume him. He made several attempts to reverse his decision, first by trying to strip Alexander of his titles and then, according to the historians, by attempting to have him assassinated. Each attempt failed, thwarted by the vigilance of Maesa and Alexander's mother, Julia Mamea, and only served to further solidify the Praetorians' loyalty to Alexander. They saw the emperor not just as a degenerate, but as a treacherous tyrant willing to murder his own family. The situation came to a head in a dramatic confrontation within the Praetorian camp. Elagabalus, in a fit of rage, ordered the arrest and execution of some of the guards he believed were most loyal to his cousin. The Praetorians mutinied, refusing the order and demanding to see both Elagabalus and Alexander together in the camp to ensure the Caesar's safety. On the 11th of March, 222, the emperor and his cousin, accompanied by their respective mothers, Soamias and Mamaia, entered the Praetorian barracks. It was a fatal miscalculation. The soldiers immediately mobbed Alexander, cheering him and ignoring the emperor. Enraged, Elagabalus ordered the arrest of the ringleaders of this display of insubordination. It was the final spark that ignited the powder keg. The Praetorians, their patience exhausted and their loyalty to Alexander absolute, turned on him. The carefully constructed world of the priest-king of Emesa was about to come crashing down in a torrent of steel and fury. The final act had begun. The scene within the Praetorian camp devolved into chaos with terrifying speed. The soldiers, their simmering resentment finally boiling over into open revolt, drew their swords. Their target was clear. The emperor who had for 4 years mocked their traditions, insulted their masculinity, and now threatened the life of their chosen successor. Julia Soamias, seeing the murderous intent in the eyes of the guards, threw herself around her son, trying to shield him with her own body. It was a futile gesture of maternal desperation. The Praetorians, their bloodlust ignited, were beyond reason. They cut her down without hesitation, her death a mere prelude to the main event. Elagabalus, stripped of his divine pretensions and reduced to a terrified teenager, scrambled for a place to hide. He was found cowering in a large chest or a latrine, a pathetic and ignominious end for a man who had styled himself a living god. He was dragged out, screaming for his life, and dispatched with brutal efficiency. The soldiers' fury, however, was not sated by his death. They sought not just to kill the man, but to erase the memory of his reign, to purify Rome of his stain through the ultimate act of public humiliation, damnatio memoriae. His body was subjected to a grotesque post-mortem punishment. They first attempted to stuff his corpse into a sewer drain, but it was too small. In their rage, they attached weights to the body and dragged it through the streets of Rome, a horrifying spectacle for the urban populace who had once witnessed his grand religious processions. The crowds that had watched his ecstatic dances now watched his lifeless form being desecrated. The final indignity was reserved for the Tiber River. The soldiers hauled his mutilated corpse to the Aemilian Bridge and cast it into the murky water, a symbolic cleansing of the city. His mother's body was treated with similar contempt and thrown into the river alongside him. The message was unequivocal. Their corruption was so profound that they were denied a proper burial, their spirits condemned to wander the earth forever. The purge extended to his entire administration. His lovers and favorites, the men he had elevated to positions of power, were rounded up and systematically executed. Hierocles, the Carian charioteer for whom he had debased himself, was put to death. Aurelius Zoticus, his short-lived husband, met a similar fate. Any official, high or low, who was closely associated with the fallen regime was hunted down. The Elagabalus, his grand temple on the Palatine, was rededicated to Jupiter. The black stone of Emesa, the physical embodiment of his religious revolution, was unceremoniously shipped back to Syria, its brief, tumultuous reign over Rome brought to an end. The Senate, with a sense of profound relief, officially condemned his memory. His name was struck from all public inscriptions, his statues were torn down, and his laws were rescinded. He was to be known officially only by his birth name, Varius Avitus Bassianus. The name Elagabalus, the name of his god, was to be forgotten. In the immediate aftermath, power consolidated smoothly around the victors. The 13-year-old Severus Alexander was proclaimed emperor, with his mother, Julia Mamaea, and his grandmother, the ever-present Julia Maesa, acting as his regents. Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. The reign of the Orgy king had been a brief but terrifying fever, a 4-year plunge into religious and social chaos. His death was not just an assassination, it was an exorcism. The city had purged itself of a foreign contagion and restored what it saw as the natural order. The propaganda machine went into overdrive, cementing the image of Elagabalus that has largely persisted for 2 millennia, a monster of depravity, the epitome of the decadent, effeminate, and cruel Oriental tyrant. It was a narrative that served the new regime perfectly, justifying their bloody coup and presenting Alexander as the virtuous savior of Roman tradition. The historical reputation of Elagabalus was sealed in the immediate aftermath of his murder. The accounts that survived, primarily from the senatorial historian Cassius Dio and the later, highly sensationalized Historia Augusta, were written by his enemies. They had every reason to portray him in the worst possible light, to create a caricature of Oriental decadence and sexual depravity that would serve as a permanent justification for his overthrow. For them, he was not a complex individual but a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world: the erosion of traditional Roman values, the corrupting influence of the East, and the dangers of unchecked absolute power in the hands of the unworthy. This narrative of the monster emperor, the Orgy king, has proven remarkably durable, echoing through the works of later historians like Edward Gibbon, who saw his reign as a nadir of Roman decline. He became a cautionary tale, a historical bogeyman representing the ultimate failure of imperial leadership. However, a more nuanced modern perspective, while not exonerating him of his cruelty and political incompetence, seeks to understand him within his own context. Elagabalus was, first and foremost, a product of his upbringing. He was not a Roman aristocrat but a Syrian priest, raised from birth to be the chief servant, and perhaps the living embodiment, of his local deity. His actions in Rome, so shocking to the Senate, were a logical extension of his life's purpose: to elevate his god to supremacy. His religious fanaticism was not a political ploy, it was a genuine, deeply held conviction. He was attempting to impose the syncretic, monarchical traditions of the Hellenistic East onto a Roman political system that still clung to the fiction of the emperor as the first citizen. It was a cultural and religious clash that was destined for a violent conclusion. His famed sexual and gender nonconformity can also be re-examined. While the stories of palace brothels and attempts at sex reassignment surgery are likely hostile fabrications, the core accusation that he rejected Roman masculinity and embraced a female persona seems undeniable. In the context of his religious background, this may not have been mere personal preference. In many ancient Near Eastern cults, priests engaged in ritual cross-dressing or castration, a practice known as galley priesthood, to better serve a goddess. While Elagabalus was a male deity, the ecstatic, and what Romans would call effeminate, style of worship was a key feature of many regional cults. Elagabalus may have been performing a religious role, expressing his devotion in a way that was traditional in Emesa, but utterly alien and abhorrent in Rome. He was, in a sense, a victim of a profound cultural misunderstanding, a man whose identity was forged in one world and judged by the standards of another. This does not excuse his political failures. His appointments were disastrous, his disregard for the Senate was foolish, and his cruelty was real. He lacked the political skill of his grandmother, the pragmatism needed to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman power. He was a zealot, not a statesman, a teenager given absolute power who used it to pursue his personal obsessions with a reckless disregard for the consequences. His reign represents a fascinating intersection of power, religion, and identity. He challenged the very foundations of what it meant to be Roman and what it meant to be an emperor. He forced a confrontation between the traditions of the capital and the diverse beliefs of its vast empire. The tragedy of Elagabalus is not just that of a debauched tyrant, but of a cultural and religious revolutionary who was too young, too fanatical, and too politically inept to succeed. He attempted to remake Rome in the image of his god, and in the end, Rome remade him into a monster to justify his destruction. His legacy is a testament to the fact that history is indeed written by the victors, a garish and brutal reminder that the line between a god and a monster is often drawn by the sword. The brief, chaotic reign of Elagabalus serves as more than just a lurid footnote in the history of the Roman Empire. It is a profound exploration of the collision between absolute power and radical identity. He was not merely a bad emperor in the mold of a Caligula or a Nero, whose tyrannies operated within a recognizable, if terrifying, Roman framework. Elagabalus was something else entirely, an outsider who sought not just to rule Rome, but to fundamentally transform its soul. His story forces us to confront the nature of historical narratives and the ways in which they are constructed to serve the political needs of the present. The image of the Orgy king is a masterpiece of political propaganda, a caricature so potent that it has almost completely obscured the more complex reality. The new regime of Severus Alexander needed a monster to justify the brutal murder of a 14-year-old boy and his mother. They needed to frame their coup not as a naked power grab, but as a necessary exorcism of a foreign evil that threatened the state. Thus, every aspect of Elagabalus's identity that deviated from the Roman norm's Syrian heritage, his fervent religious practices, his gender-fluid self-expression was weaponized, exaggerated, and woven into a narrative of monstrous depravity. This process of othering is a timeless political tool. By casting Elagabalus as fundamentally alien, his enemies could delegitimize him in a way that simple accusations of tyranny could not. He was not just a bad Roman, he was not Roman at all. His reign becomes a dark mirror reflecting the anxieties of the Roman elite, the fear of the East, the fear of powerful women, the fear of religious change, and perhaps most profoundly, the fear of the dissolution of traditional gender roles which formed the bedrock of their patriarchal society. In an age before the language of transgender identity existed, Elagabalus's desire to live as a woman was framed as the ultimate proof of his madness and unfitness to rule. His story is a stark reminder of the violence that societies often inflict upon those who transgress their most deeply held norms. He was a high priest from a culture where his form of worship was sacred, and an individual whose personal identity was in profound conflict with the rigid expectations of his new role. Placed on the throne of the world, he refused to compromise, attempting to force an entire empire to conform to his personal reality. It was an act of supreme arrogance, but also, perhaps, of a strange and misguided integrity. He was, in his own way, relentlessly authentic to his own beliefs and identity, even when it was politically suicidal to do so. The legacy of Elagabalus, therefore, is a dual one. On the one hand, he is the historical archetype of the failed ruler, a lesson in how not to govern. His reign was a disaster marked by incompetence, cruelty, and a complete failure to understand the political culture he was supposed to lead. On the other hand, He has become a figure of fascination for those who see in him a proto-queer icon, a martyr to gender conformity, a rebel who used his power to live his truth in the most public and defiant way imaginable. While we must be cautious not to apply modern labels anachronistically, it is impossible to ignore the radical challenge he posed to the ancient world's conception of power and identity. His 4-year reign was a violent, incandescent flame that burned through the heart of Rome, and in its ashes, we can still discern the timeless and often brutal struggle between the power of the institution and the will of the individual. The fall of Elagabalus and the rise of Severus Alexander did not, as the victors had hoped, usher in a new golden age. Instead, it marked the beginning of the end for the Severan dynasty and a descent into the even greater chaos of the crisis of the 3rd century. The reign of Alexander, guided by his mother Julia Mamaea, was an attempt to turn back the clock, to restore the dignity of the Senate and the traditions that Elagabalus had so gleefully desecrated. Alexander was the anti-Elagabalus in every respect, modest, serious, and deferential to the senatorial class. He ruled for 13 years, a period of relative domestic tranquility that stands in stark contrast to the tumult that preceded it. However, the fundamental problem that had plagued the empire for decades remained: the absolute dependence of the emperor on the loyalty of the army. Alexander and his mother, in their efforts to restore civilian rule and curb military spending, ultimately alienated the legions. They were seen as weak, dominated by a woman, and unwilling to lead from the front. In 235, while on campaign against Germanic tribes, the army's patience finally broke. Led by a brutish Thracian soldier named Maximinus Thrax, the legions of the Rhine mutinied, murdering both the 27-year-old Alexander and his mother, Julia Mamaea. The Severan dynasty, which had begun with the military coup of Septimius Severus, ended with one. The assassination of Severus Alexander plunged the Roman world into a half-century of anarchy. The period known as the crisis of the 3rd century saw the empire nearly collapse under the combined weight of constant civil war, foreign invasions, economic depression, and plague. In the 50 years between 235 and 284, there were at least 26 claimants to the imperial throne, most of them barracks emperors proclaimed by their troops and destined to rule for only a few months or years before meeting a violent end. In this context of unrelenting chaos, the reign of Elagabalus takes on a different light. It was not an isolated anomaly, but rather a particularly lurid symptom of a much deeper sickness within the imperial system. The system itself was broken. The reliance on military might, the vast and culturally diverse nature of the empire, and the lack of a clear and stable system of succession created a perfect storm for instability. The story of Elagabalus demonstrates the fragility of Roman identity in this period. The empire was a vast mosaic of different cultures, religions, and traditions, held together by the power of the legions and the symbolic authority of the emperor. When the emperor himself became a force for cultural and religious disruption, the entire edifice was threatened. The violent reaction against him was a desperate attempt by the Roman establishment to reassert a traditional, conservative identity that was already beginning to fracture under the immense pressures of a changing world. His reign was a stress test that the system spectacularly failed. The propaganda that followed his death was not just about justifying a murder, it was about creating a unifying enemy, a symbol of foreign corruption against which a true Roman identity could be defined. This narrative was a form of political therapy for a traumatized elite, a way of making sense of the chaos by personifying it in one reviled figure. Ultimately, the tale of Elagabalus is a story of boundaries. The boundary between God and mortal, between male and female, between East and West, between the personal desires of the ruler and the political necessities of the state. He crossed every one of these boundaries with a reckless abandon that was both breathtaking and catastrophic. He stands as a monument to the destructive potential of power when it is untethered from wisdom, empathy, and a respect for the society it is meant to lead. His ghost haunts the ruins of the Palatine, a silent testament to a time when a Syrian priest-king tried to make the sun set on the gods of Rome, only to be consumed by the darkness that followed. In the grand, blood-soaked tapestry of Roman history, the thread of Elagabalus's reign is woven in colors so garish and strange that it seems to belong to another pattern entirely. Yet, it is an integral part of the whole, a story that reveals as much about Rome as it does about the boy emperor himself. The Roman Empire, for all its claims to eternal order and justice, was a system built on violence and sustained by it. The throne was a prize to be seized, and the Praetorian Guard and the legions were the ultimate arbiters of power. Elagabalus was a product of this system just as surely as Augustus or Trajan were. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, understood the rules of the game perfectly. She used a lie, the promise of gold, and the memory of a popular tyrant to place her grandson on the throne. She played the game of Roman power politics with ruthless skill. Her mistake was in choosing a pawn who refused to be played, a piece that, once on the board, decided to invent its own rules. The story is also a powerful meditation on the nature of faith and fanaticism. Elagabalus was a true believer. His actions were not those of a cynical politician manipulating religion for his own ends. They were the actions of a zealot utterly convinced of his own divine mission. He arrived in Rome not as a conqueror, but as a missionary, seeking to convert the heart of the empire to the worship of his God. He failed to understand that Roman religion was a contract, a public and political institution deeply intertwined with the state's identity and security. It was about orthopraxy, correct practice, not orthodoxy, correct belief. One could believe in any number of foreign gods privately, but the public rites of the state gods had to be maintained. Elagabalus's attempt to impose his personal, ecstatic, and exclusive faith on this system was a fundamental misreading of Roman culture. He offered them a god of passionate, personal devotion when they wanted a divine guarantor of imperial stability. Furthermore, his reign is a stark illustration of the power of narrative to shape history. We do not, and cannot, know the real Elagabalus. The figure we see is a phantom constructed from the hostile accounts of his enemies. Every story of his depravity, every lurid detail of his sexual escapades, must be viewed through the lens of political assassination. The historians who chronicled his reign were not neutral observers. They were active participants in the damnatio memoriae, the official process of erasing him from history and replacing him with a monster. This raises a timeless question for any student of the past. How do we separate the person from the propaganda? How do we find the human being buried beneath the mountain of invective? While we can deconstruct the biases of the sources and contextualize his actions within his Syrian religious background, a definitive portrait remains elusive. He remains a figure shrouded in the smoke of incense and the fog of calumny. In the end, the story of Elagabalus is a tragedy, not in the sense of a noble hero with a fatal flaw, but in the sense of a catastrophic collision of irreconcilable worlds. He was a boy given the power of a god, a priest forced to be a politician, a product of the East set down in the heart of the West. His reign was a brief, 4-year hurricane that ripped through Rome, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a legacy of infamy. He stands as a perpetual outsider, a figure so alien to the world he was meant to rule that his very existence seemed to mock it. He was the emperor who danced, who wore silk and makeup, who married a man and a Vestal virgin, who tried to replace Jupiter with a black stone from Syria. He was a fever dream from which Rome awoke by slitting his throat and throwing his body in the river, hoping to wash away the memory of the nightmare. But the stain, and the questions his reign provokes, could never be truly cleansed.